Welcome, everyone. My name is Marlene Leones Gonzalez, and I am the Communication and Outreach Coordinator here at the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. The LAII, as we call it at the University of New Mexico, promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse throughout our programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, on which UNM sits. The original Pueblos of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere. I'm honored and excited to introduce our speaker today, Andy Rafael Aguilera. He is a doctoral candidate in history and Latinx studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is currently an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellow in Latinx Studies at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. His research utilizes categories of race and nationalism to trace the ways in ethnic Mexicans, his research utilizes categories of race and nationalism to trace the ways in ethnic Mexicans define themselves in their relationship to Mexico and Los Angeles from its foundation as a Spanish Pueblo, then a Mexican capital, and finally an American city. A first-generation student, his work hopes to complicate the construction of Mexicanidad by elucidating the negotiative practices ethnic Mexicans articulate throughout time and space. Please join me in welcoming Andy Aguilera.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. First off, I want to thank the Latin American and Iberian Institute at UNM for inviting me to share a piece of my dissertation research. It's unfortunate that we are not able to meet in person, but I hope everyone is in good health and in good spirit. Also, I want to thank Marlene Leones Gonzalez for all the help setting this up and the great introduction she just gave me. And I also want to thank the Department of History at Michigan for making all this research possible and all my progress, as well as the Mellon Foundation and School for Advanced Research for providing a crucial space and ample time to work on my project this academic year. So before I begin my presentation, I want to briefly contextualize the topic within my dissertation. So broadly, my project examines the cultural politics of Mexican Los Angeles from the mid-19th century up to 1940, although I do explore the founding of LA to kind of show the racial schema that's being created before the Mexican period. But I first assess ethnic Mexicans' negotiation of conquest and marginalization after the US-Mexico War to examine the ways in which polarizing political sensibilities articulated competing ideas of national identity, citizenship, and social meaning, and additional categories. I then argue that Los Angeles was re-Mexicanized at the turn of the century because of the Mexican Revolution. So what I mean by that is not only that the city's Mexican community grew in number, but also in the scope of ideas it had about cultural politics in imagining their relationship to the Mexican nation in a period of extreme instability and political turmoil. So by using Los Angeles as a borderlands refuge for mobilization in the show, Mexicans express their own ideas about the revolution on both sides of the political spectrum. You know, you have the Magonistas on the far left, but you also have moderates, but also conservatives that are on the far right during this period from 1900 to 1940. My focus on Ignacio Lozano and Opinión then serves to underscore this process in 1930s Los Angeles, a transitionary period in which historian George Sanchez argues that Mexicans became Mexican American. So as I will show, Lozano kind of pushed back during this process with his newspapers. So rather than going through a march in time in Opinión's first decade from 1926 roughly to 1940, I'm going to focus on moments that highlight the larger themes that the chapter engages with, and hopefully it articulates sort of the larger themes that the whole dissertation is working with. And I hope to get some questions or comments at the end of this. All right, get this. Great. In October 1934, Ignacio Lozano, Sr., newspaper mogul of La Opinión and San Antonio's La Prensa, received an urgent telegram that his papers had been prohibited from crossing the Mexican border. That same day, his correspondent from Mexico City, Jose C. Valadez, confirmed to Lozano that his papers had been marked as, quote, seditious propaganda by the Mexican government. Lozano immediately appealed to the president of Mexico, Abelardo L. Rodriguez, in a direct telegram. He pointed to Mexico's guarantee of free press to deny accusations of sedition, an argument he also made 4 years earlier when President Pascual Ortiz Rubio banned its distribution. These conflicts, one intertwined with issues of free press, border policing, and nationalism, represented one of many instances, approximately 6 between 1926 to 1934, that Lozano's papers were banned for distribution across the US-Mexico border, going the other way down to Mexico. So in contrast of northern movement of Mexican people, resources, and ideas, its prohibition highlighted a unique case in the US-Mexico borderlands. So I asked, what do such instances tell us about Lozano and his newspapers in the 1930s, particularly in Los Angeles? I show that the Lozano papers represented a transnational Mexican citizenship which clung tightly to Mexican politics and society for its readers. In this fashion, they functioned as a borderlands newspaper that sought to shape the public opinion for ethnic Mexicans across the US to impact Mexican politics in the post-revolutionary phase, a notion the revolutionary government found threatening. So here in this slide, you're going to see the telegram that Valadez initially sent to Lozano in October 1934. And this is just one of many dozens and dozens of telegrams he gets, not only from Valadez, but also from other correspondents and subscribers in parts of Mexico and south of the border, approximately between the last week of October and then mid-November of 1934. So I argue that Lozano's periodicals, and particularly La Opinión, operated as a vital institution that bridged Mexican expatriates in the US Southwest to Mexico through a debate of cultural politics. Ways in which culture, which can include people's attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and perspectives, and in this case with La Opinión and Lozano, it's going to be politics and culture, structure society and political opinion. In his examination of the Mexican press in the mid-20th century Mexico, historian Benjamin T. Smith asserts that newspapers acted as a key mediator between state citizens and the state. This linkage, he argues, thus transformed the practice of everyday politics through an increased readership across the nation. The rise of the Mexican reading public forced the Mexican government during this time period, both at the local and state level, to regulate what information was disseminated to the masses. Building on these insights, I suggest that such developments occurred decades earlier in the US Southwest. Far from the regulatory gaze of the Mexican government, Lozano's papers thus flourished. Hence, the Mexican government frequently banned distribution of his papers to censor and prohibit them from accessing a Mexican audience. Likewise, Lozano's newspaper cited that strategy as evidence of the dangers of the Mexican government that targeted Mexicans who did not agree with them. If La Opinión or La Prensa acted as a key mediator between Mexican expatriates and the Mexican government, then its contributors, of which resided on both sides of the border, and in some cases other Latin American countries, acted as cultural brokers, the process in which individuals acted as mediators between two or more parties. Lozano and his contributors largely strove to initiate and maintain contact with Mexican society for recent Mexican exiles and immigrants in the US Southwest. Surely many individuals and families sustained their own personal contacts to the patria. However, Lozano's periodicals pursued their own articulation of cultural politics, defined by civic duty into a collective experience for its readers. Ultimately, these works and their contributors rekindled Mexican expatriates' relationship with the Mexican state and vice versa, into a form of diasporic nationalism. So here I define that so this type of nationalism emerges as a reactionary ethno-nationalism within global knowledge diasporas, who appear to be bilingual cross-cultural negotiators moving regularly between different cultures and participating in exchanges across national borders. So here the paper even itself meets the definition of this criteria, as we'll see. Lastly, I want to distinguish Lozano's prints as a borderlands newspaper to further unveil significance during this period. Scholars have previously defined them as exile newspapers based on its early content and intended audience. In her content analysis of La Opinión's first 3 years, scholar Francine Medeiros found that over 70% of the articles dealt with issues of Mexico to prepare a return for its readers. This in turn made it, quote, an exile newspaper. Others, however, have pushed back on this label by suggesting that the paper and its leadership did not practice exile politics by their apparent lack of support of one party or candidate in Mexico. At various points, however, they aligned themselves with anti-re-election ideology by backing various intellectuals and politicians against the revolutionary government in Mexico. So residing in the borderlands, the Mexican newspaper thus utilized the border as a strategic site of negotiation and in expanding Mexico de afuera to shape Mexico's politics from afar. So, born in Nuevo León, Mexico in 1886, Ignacio y Lozano arrived in San Antonio with his mothers and sisters in 1908 at the age of 22. Products of a revolutionary diaspora at the assumption of the revolution, the Lozano family found refuge in a city with a vastly growing Mexican population. In 1900, for example, Mexicans consisted of 26% of the population, with an increase to 37% by 1920. Upon his arrival, Lozano continued his passion for print he founded in Mexico by working with local Spanish newspapers. The Lozano family appeared to have a keen interest in the power of print as well. The family opened a bookstore right next door to a newspaper office ran by the Lozano sisters. By 1913, the young Ignacio founded La Prensa as a weekly newsletter with a mere $1,200 in savings. Its first issue proudly proclaimed, "Venimos a luchar," we come to fight, against the Mexican government with liberty and absolute honesty. It promised its readers a role as a sincere friend to position itself as an outlet for compatriots residing in the United States for unfolding news of the revolution in Mexico. As such, he regularly deployed the insights of other exiled Mexicans to contribute to the newspaper. Lozano thus strategically tapped into the interest of a growing Mexican community and diaspora who yearned of news of their homeland during a period of immense violence and instability. Lozano also set its sights on reaching other Mexican communities where no Spanish newspapers were readily available. Rolando Hinojosa Smith, a Mexican resident in South Texas, for example, recounts how he met the local train to pick up copies of La Prensa for distribution in his local town in 1930. Within a year of its establishment, La Prensa's popularity called for a larger printing press to transform the weekly into a daily newspaper. A range of Mexican politicians and intellectuals, such as Jose Vasconcelos, regularly contributed to the paper, which made it popular not only in Texas, but also for readers in Mexico itself. By the mid-1920s, it had become a prominent forum for Mexican conservatives on both sides of the border. Some scholars suggest La Patria largely served the interests of upper-class Mexicans while eschewing those of the working class. Historian Richard A. Garcia suggests that La Prensa's contributors were largely critical of lower-class Mexicans and Mexican Americans through supposed perceptions that they were shedding their Mexican identity in favor of Americanization. As a result, these writers and intellectuals largely promoted an eventual return to Mexico with the hope of building the nation through politics and high culture. This critique, however, cannot be separated from the context in which the paper was first established. Mexican migration during the early 20th century consisted of elite exiles who escaped the Diaz dictatorship and populist rhetoric of the Mexican Revolution. Subsequent waves of migration included the middle and working classes who sought an increased quality of life or opportunity in the US as a refuge from the revolution. Still, the paper found ways to contribute to the working class experience. For instance, Ruben Menguia, a Mexican printer in Texas, credited La Prensa's accessibility for the masses. He asserted that working class Mexicans could, quote, live better, they could send their children to school, they could indulge in the luxury of buying La Prensa and in slowly picking out the forbidden letters to educate themselves, end quote. No matter the case, Lozano and La Prensa clearly looked towards Mexican society and politics at its inception with the vision that their stay in the US was only temporary. As scholar Maggie Rivas Rodriguez articulates, Lozano, quote, believed his role as an opinion leader of the exiled Mexican community was to elevate his countrymen so that when political stability was established in Mexico, the masses of Mexican immigrants could return, end quote. Crucial to that vision then was uplift and retainment of Mexican identity and citizenship for those residing in the US. Lozano thus largely resisted acculturation by centering politics and culture as essential to Mexican identity, as representative of the revolutionary diaspora. So in June 1920, he wrote to President Adolfo de la Huerta via the Mexican consulate that he would embark on, quote, special mission to contribute to his success. In a direct letter to the president weeks later, Lozano promoted and emphasized the significance of La Prensa. He asserted that he considered, quote, of great interest to publish his authoritative opinion on transcendental matters for the knowledge of thousands of compatriots residing in the United States, end quote. In this way, Lozano positioned himself as the voice of Mexicans in the United States, as a direct mediator between the Mexican government and the diaspora, a role he solidified himself in as his success increased in later decades. Moreover, he reminded de la Huerta that his success and paper tracked Mexican politics through efforts to shape the Mexican opinion in the US. So this trend continues in La Prensa and later in La Opinión, Los Angeles, in which Lozano further emphasizes his leadership and significance for Mexicans. So on September 16th, 1926, Mexican Independence Day, the first issue of La Opinión was printed. Always the pragmatist, Lozano discovered he could greatly cut shipping costs to Los Angeles and its periphery by forming his own newspaper there for distribution in the city. Moreover, the growing Mexican population bristled with potential for a successful Spanish daily. Between 1900 and 1930, over 1.5 million migrants crossed the US-Mexico border because of the revolution. Los Angeles, in particular, had one of the most rapid expansions of its Mexican population during this period. So for instance, in 1900, the Mexican population is numbered approximately around 5,600. By 1914, it would increase to around 35 to 40,000. In 1930, 4 years after the founding of La Opinión, the Mexican population is estimated to have numbered around at least 97,000. According to this chart, as you see here, it might have numbered as high as 190,000. But this just goes to show how significant La Opinión was in 1926 and how Lozano used it to kind of shape the Mexican opinion there. Although with varying results, which we can get into in the Q&A. So to be sure, the Los Angeles-based newspaper followed the success of La Prensa in content and form. However, while La Opinión mimicked its San Antonio predecessor, it should not be understood merely as a carbon copy of it. In its first issue, the paper appealed to readers in California by claiming to serve the interests of the Mexican community. The paper acknowledged their distance as strangers residing in San Antonio, yet bonded them within the collective struggle as Mexican immigrants and exiles. By doing so, the paper tied readers of La Opinión in Los Angeles and La Prensa in San Antonio into an imagined community on the US-Mexico borderlands. As the introduction continued, the paper reassured readers that they were not pretending to fill a void of the Mexican press in Los Angeles. A few others did exist during this period. But rather, the paper sought to provide a serious and useful perspective for Los Angeles's Mexican communities. Finally, it concluded that it was there to do, quote, the honest and healthy work, and would do so to gain the will of its reading public. Despite claims of not seeking to fill a void, this brief introduction set a sort of battleground for readers, which suggested it would provide something Los Angeles's Mexican community so desperately needed, which was a voice. As a successful newspaper mogul in San Antonio, Lozano recognized the immense potential of the ever-growing Mexican population in Los Angeles and Southern California more broadly. He strategically used La Prensa as a pedigree to reiterate his authority of Mexican affairs on the borderlands, but more importantly, to lead a hegemonic space between San Antonio and La Prensa. Days later, Victoriano Salado Alvarez, a prominent Mexican writer, lauded the formation of a Lozano daily in Los Angeles by claiming it sustained and promoted Mexican patriotism. Echoing the first issue's introduction, Alvarez utilized La Prensa's contributions as a blueprint for success in Los Angeles. La Opinión, he claimed, did not need its own program because it had been in practice for over a dozen years in San Antonio, where it entered every Mexican household to make their life less difficult and more humane. In doing so, he suggested, it helped guide the opinion of its expatriates. Its absence would have left a great void of, quote, pitiful falls and terrible disenchantment. He continued by making a bold claim that 2 to 3 million Mexicans in the US used the paper to shape their opinions, or at the very least, acknowledge its significance as a friend and leader. More importantly, however, Alvarez noted the important role the periodical played in combating Americanization efforts of Mexican expatriates by rekindling notions of Mexicanidad. Finally, Alvarez claimed, perhaps in jest, that there resided more Mexicans in Los Angeles and Southern California than in Puebla and Guadalajara, 2 Mexican states. Therefore, the creation of La Opinión was not only necessary, but booming with potential to homogenize a growing Mexican public into a readership of Mexican society and politics. So the establishment of La Opinión coincided with the brewing conflict between the US and Nicaragua during the Nicaraguan Civil War. This issue dominated much of the periodical's front page news in its first years that provides some insights into the formation of cultural politics for Mexican exiles in the US. Although not directly focusing on issues of Mexican politics and society, this coverage linked Nicaragua's own struggles to broader issues of Pan-Americanism to critique the Mexican government. So for context here, the United States had occupied Nicaragua since 1912 as part of their imperial pursuits in Latin America, in countries such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as well as the Philippines and the Pacific. Unlike those countries, however, the US pursued another imperial tactic in Nicaragua, which gave US bankers control over the country's finances, known as dollar diplomacy, a model which would eventually steer US foreign policy in Latin America. In Nicaragua, however, this form of imperialism worked purposefully to prevent other nation states from taking advantage of the country's economic instability to build a new canal that might rival the Panama Canal. Nicaraguan nationalists viewed this economic imperialism as an affront to their nation's progress. Economic autonomy thus became the supreme ideology against US imperialism, at least according to this article. After a decade of unrest in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge finally ordered a full-scale military invasion of Nicaragua to quell the rebels. So US intervention in the Civil War became inextricably linked with Mexico's autonomy in North America. On November 21st, 1926, the paper reported that US-Mexico relations were quickly deteriorating due to the threat of expropriation of oil properties owned by American and British businessmen in Mexico. That same coverage linked this relationship with American designs of a rumored province in Nicaragua, which the piece reported was a step, quote, taken to prevent further spreading of Mexican radicalism in Central America. This also expressed a critique of American imperialism that had major implications for the Mexican nation. If such a territory were established, the paper warned, the US would maintain supremacy between Mexico and the Panama Canal. It claimed that Mexicans in the US understood the tension between the two nations as a struggle on who controlled, quote, hegemony of the small Central American countries. So framing Nicaragua and Central America as an important hegemonic zone, the coverage first rooted the struggle as a longer pattern of US imperialism in Latin America. So by January 1927, the US displayed a show of force to sustain the Adolfo Diaz regime by undermining the Juan Bautista Sacasa coup, arriving with 15 warships, 215 officials, and over 4,500 Marine and Army personnel. The paper reported that the invasion also served as an intimidation tactic towards Mexico. Later calling Mexico the match and the United States the spark, Nicaragua continued to be carefully tracked as a potential powder keg for another world war. Chiefly concerned with the tenets of democracy, La Opinión began to articulate the conflict as one with deep implications for Latin America and Mexicans. First critiquing US empire, the paper also continued to lambast other colonial countries such as France, Spain, and Russia as supplanting their might over weaker countries. These nations, they continued, claim supreme knowledge of culture and civilization. Their efforts to bring their colonial projects to other nations ultimately brought more violence and, quote, barbarism itself, end quote. Lozano's papers thus critique the United States intervention and back the nation's sovereignty over their own affairs and Pan-American solidarity. As the conflict developed in subsequent months, La Opinión began to publish extensive essays by Mexican journalist Guillermo Yeme entitled Intervention and Patriotism. These series of articles highlighted a curated version of Latinidad and Mexicanidad for the paper's readers in relation to notions of empire and nationalism. Reflecting on the US-Mexico War, Prieto Yeme claimed that it implied, quote, the idea of a brutal conquest with mutilation, which had undermined Mexico's sovereignty. Despite this collective experience, he argued, the idea of a Mexican nation remained imperfect among Mexicans. Prieto Yeme began to articulate race and patriotism in relation to, quote, in the face of international problems defined by US imperialism. He quickly noted that American intervention was not so much a looming threat from the North as much as one enabled by Mexican politicians. In other words, the, quote, customary disorders in Mexico raised fears and enabled American intervention within Mexican affairs. This, he believed, unveiled two irreconcilable entities in Mexico. On one hand, the Mexican people, on the other, the Mexican government. While Prieto Yeme initially critiqued US imperialism, he also linked its rise with the failing Mexican political system he claimed had not represented the Mexican populace since 1823. Thus, if he defined the Mexican patria by conquest, he ultimately began to provide a template of Mexican cultural politics, which hinged greatly on democratic participation. In other words, what banded the Mexican populace is a keen desire to participate and guide a government whose key goal was to represent them. Prieto Yeme's idea of the Mexican people then signified a deep connection to a political participation in constructing the Mexican nation. A day after Prieto Yeme's third part of his polemic, the US reportedly critiqued the Mexican government's propaganda efforts. In energetic protest, the US government took note of Mexico's critique of American intervention, both in Nicaragua and Mexico. Furthermore, they greatly criticized Mexico's support of General Sacasa and the revolutionaries after the US had formally recognized the Adolfo Diaz regime. Lastly, US officials ironically saw an infringement on their own sovereignty after noting that Mexico had made attempts to steer public opinion within the United States. Although not a state-regulated paper, La Opinión's publication of Prieto Yeme's Intervention and Patriotism served as a prime example of what the American government had objected to, which was a steering of Mexican public opinion in the US. He ultimately expressed immense frustration with Mexican politicians who had betrayed them since the inception of the Mexican Revolution by catering to the United States. Here, the editorial began to situate the results of the Mexican Revolution as an era of corruption deeply colluded by American intervention. Quote, the agents of the constitutionalist revolution, he asserted, knew how to present their case in Washington for recognition, despite not having the slightest idea what the problems of Mexican were, end quote, nor the Mexicans had claimed to have represented. While the Mexican populace had submitted themselves to the promises of the revolution, the United States, he asserted, had come to a full realization. Quote, the stability of Hispanic American governments needed to be ensured through international sanctions. In other words, intervention and empire. So Mexican politics was driven by American interests and enabled by Mexican officials for their own ends, according to Prieto Yeme. So his point was actually confirmed on March 13, 1927, when La Opinión reported that President Calles had conceded to US diplomats on accusations of Mexican propaganda regarding Nicaragua. He, alongside the former Mexican president Álvaro Obregón, assured the US that anti-American propaganda would end and that no obstruction of their policy in Nicaragua will, quote, happen again in the future. Even more significantly, they conceded to US officials and foreign businessmen that they would not expropriate their properties. In this way, the paper began to construct the larger failings of the Mexican government and called on Mexicans on both sides of the border to hold their politicians accountable for greater autonomy and peace in the nation, a theme which would continue in the paper over the next decade. Give me a second here. So on September 16th, 1927, the paper celebrated the one-year anniversary and Mexican Independence Day simultaneously. Nemesio Garcia Naranjo, a prominent Mexican intellectual, lauded the paper's successful first year. Born in Nuevo León, like Lozano, in March 1883, Naranjo traversed the US-Mexico border during his childhood. After serving in the Francisco Madero and Huerta administrations, Naranjo fled to exile in San Antonio after the fall of the Huerta regime in 1914. While there, Naranjo worked to organize the exile community, all while expressing, quote, strong nationalistic views towards Mexico, to organize the exile community and through an impassioned opposition to President Carranza. Like other contributors and allies of Lozano's papers, Naranjo represented the revolutionary diaspora's transnational cultural politics. He thus credited Lozano with equipping Los Angeles with a respectable Mexican newspaper that included exclusive collaboration and presentation. By focusing on the paper's professionalism, Naranjo thus painted La Opinión as a modern first-rate institution of journalism, a notion previously dubbed as an impossible order for California's Mexicans. A successful first year, he stated, acted as, quote, a triumph in the manner of jubilee for the entire Mexican colony. Naranjo, however, did not lionize Lozano as the sole contributor to this important institution in Los Angeles. Instead, he also celebrated the journalists and intellectuals for their original compelling contributions that filled the daily. Still, he greatly emphasized Lozano's role in paving the way for a paper dedicated to the pursuit of truth and, quote, noble cultivation of authentic Mexicanidad, which exalted the glories of Patria and addressing the corrosion existing within it. He concluded in a celebratory letter by refuting critics who claimed Lozano's daily in LA that it was identical to La Prensa in San Antonio. Besides sharing the same contributors, telegraphic services, and patriotic orientation, Naranjo differentiated the two by painting La Opinión as a daughter of the San Antonio print. La Prensa, he asserted, took a more serene character, while LA's daily exhibited a more vehement dynamism of renewal. His descriptive imagery therefore treated La Opinión as a print which greatly reinvigorated the political sensibilities of LA's Mexican community, a contribution needed as the city's Mexican community grew exponentially during these years. By September 1928, Plutarco Calles, former president of Mexico, announced the pursuit of a nation of institutions and laws after the assassination of President-elect Álvaro Obregón, by uniting all revolutionaries under the National Revolutionary Party. Naming himself the leader, he subsequently handed the presidency to Emilio Portes Gil. Only Calles, noted party officials, held the training to lead this new political party through his awareness of the problems and difficulties it will encounter. La Opinión condemned the establishment of the new revolutionary party, as well as Calles' leadership, as a sign of continued corruption in Mexican politics. Taking Calles' call for Mexican unity, the paper questioned the discourse which invited the Mexican masses to mobilize under the revolutionary banner. Do the dead, they pondered, and those executed during the revolution say nothing. Furthermore, it provoked the Mexican people to consider the last 18 years of the revolution and the conflict between its leaders and conservative opponents. Favoring the latter's position, the editorial further raised the stakes between the two political poles in a brewing battle that Mexicans in the US needed to take a part of. An editorial by Juan Sanchez Ascona, a Mexican journalist exiled in Cuba, helps illustrate this point. He reminded readers that expatriation, no matter the cause and circumstances, could, quote, never mean a disengagement from the homeland. In fact, being far from the homeland could harness a greater love for the nation on the assumption that the expatriate may only recall their affections for it rather than the unrest. Ascona highlighted how other expatriates from other countries maintain their relationship to their homelands through their engagement with its politics. To be sure, the case remained the same for Mexicans throughout the US. Ascona thus aimed to tap into the Mexican immigrants' exiles' potential to view Mexican politics with a fresh perspective due to their distance from it. For instance, leaders in Mexico claimed that, quote, political rights must only be exercised in the homeland. Ascona countered this stance by instructing readers to reject the Mexican leaders' label on expatriates as pariahs of the patria by recognizing the crucial status ex-Mexican political subjects. Moreover, he treated their experiences in the US, namely their exposure to the democratic process, as a positive factor in their status. By learning the meaning of citizenship while residing in the US, he figured they could ascribe these values in Mexico. Brushing aside experiences of xenophobia and racism, Ascona romanticized the Mexican-American experience on the borderlands in favor of their status as modern political subjects. Still, La Opinión utilized this rhetoric with the hopes to conjure an increased political position for Mexicans in developing a true transnational Mexico de afuera. In that very same process, it contributed to the construction of Mexicanidad, a version defined by nationalism and electoral participation, of which Ascona concluded is the most effective way to ignite patriotism. In 1929, Ascona again lauded La Opinión. First calling Lozano a true Mexican patriot, he credited the print mogul for watching over his people in regions in which they received harsh treatment, both from US officials, but also the Mexican government. Moreover, he called the Lozano prints true Mexican publications, despite them being published in a foreign land. He even went as far as to call them, quote, more generally Mexican, end quote, than periodicals published in Mexico, many of which he claimed had forgotten the true national interest through, quote, colorless themes. In this process, he also began to trace the paper's success and goals in relation to Mexican populations on the borderlands. Like the Lozano periodicals, a vast population remained independent in thought. The two thus worked in tandem as guardians to illustrate a free-thinking community away from the persecution and silencing of their home government. The most important point, however, was Ascona's claim that the Lozano's papers acted as a middle ground between Mexico de afuera and those on the inside on the nation. The dailies provided a model for Mexico by exemplifying the intense spiritual and moral bonds Mexicans in the US exhibited, or so Ascona claimed. Likewise, Mexicans looked southward at the instability occurring in Mexico when framing their cultural politics. By bridging the divide between these two Mexicos, Ascona indirectly expanded the parameters of Mexicanidad, one much defined by political freedom, thought, and participation, even if you lived outside of the confines of the territory. By bridging these two Mexicos, he ultimately created an ideological borderland with two varying experiences between them. His account also highlighted the subversive use of the physical border as a forum to practice that freedom, particularly that of political thought and critiques of the Mexican government. If the Lozano prints acted as a linkage between Mexico de afuera and adentro, then it also served as a prime example as a contrary form of cultural politics on Mexico's future. The periodicals thus backed anti-re-election candidate Jose Vasconcelos in the 1929 presidential elections. Vasconcelos, a prominent Mexican intellectual, appealed to Mexico de afuera by emphasizing the political instability and oppression occurring in the homeland. Through his strategic request for the aid of the Mexican foreign press, in this case, he utilizes La Opinión and La Prensa, Vasconcelos sought to gain the backing of the vast Mexican expatriate community against what they deemed a tyrannical government. His emotional outreach surely signified his aim to utilize the transnational awareness of the Mexican election. More significantly, However, it continued to illustrate the important role Mexicans in Los Angeles and more broadly the Southwest served in the Mexican national imagination. Like Lozano and other contributors, Vasconcelos did not deem the residents in negative light. Instead, it proved the existence of a greater Mexico, one that could deeply influence its inner developments. After the Revolutionary Party's nominee, Pascual Ortiz Rubio, gained over 90% of the vote in November, an uproar of corruption in the electoral process flooded the pages of La Opinión that further escalated their political leanings in subsequent years and confirmed their warnings of the revolutionary government. Although Lozano and his papers backed Vasconcelos' candidacy, the paper reminded readers they remained politically independent in thought. After months of discontent from the previous election, it clarified their position that served the expatriates in a Mexican spirit. Despite the mass content on Mexican politics since the paper's inception, as well as in La Prensa, Lozano claimed that Opinión was neither a partisan nor political paper. Instead, when the paper spoke of politics, it did so as a service to the patria. I mean, to be sure, however, the paper did take sides in the Mexican political carousel. However, one should not easily dismiss Lozano's puzzling claim. Rather than functioning as a political paper, as he denied, La Opinión operated as an inherent nationalist periodical, deeply embedded in the interests of the Mexican nation and his people on both sides of the border. Lozano addressed critiques on the treatment of Calles and support of Vasconcelos in the 1929 election. First, he assured readers that they did not consider themselves enemies of Calles, and their attacks on him were not systematic. Secondly, it acknowledged the support and friendship of Vasconcelos, yet reiterated their stance as independent of party lines. These points worked to show the agency of Lozano and his periodicals by reiterating that they were not pawns, but political subjects who came to their own conclusions. And they also encourage his readers to come to their own conclusions, despite sort of this promotion of certain candidates and politics in the papers. Moreover, it continued to emphasize the significance of political participation as a linkage to the patria, no matter what one's political leanings. Give me 1 second here, having some technical issues. I think we'll forget about this one right here. Yeah. Can you guys hear me still? Cool. All right, so let's forget that last slide here. It's not going to be, I don't think it's working right now. So by the mid-1930s, La Opinión had gained enough significant political influence on both sides of the border that it was banned for distribution in Mexico at various points due to its frequent critiques of the Mexican government. So like I said, it happened around 6 times. It happened once in 1927, then again in 1929. Then it happened twice in 1934, then again in 1935. And I think I'm forgetting one more time where it got banned there. But by and large, however, La Opinión continued to encourage Mexicans in the US to influence Mexican politics through citizenship and democratic participation. In April 1937, for instance, the paper held a contest which called on readers from Canada to Yucatan to submit 36 presidential candidates for the Mexican presidency. Subscribers of, quote, all Mexicans of nationality or blood, end quote, were instructed to completely fill out a form with their desired candidates. Voters who correctly aligned with the popular vote, as well as the paper's own candidates, were guaranteed prizes ranging from $100 to $250. Although the contest surely meant to increase the paper sales, it also represented a civic practice that the paper routinely promoted since its inception. Indeed, a few days after the initial announcement, the paper reminded readers of the contest's purpose in 3 points. First, it meant to revive the civic spirit of the patria and Mexicans on both sides of the border to think about the nation's future. Second, to acknowledge the opinion of the mass public. And finally, to stimulate the integrity of the imagined election through a notary who would confirm the legitimate results. Likewise, they instructed participants not to treat the contest as a riddle or game of chance to be solved for the prize. Instead, the contest represented a platform in which to critically think about candidates. In essence, La Opinión embarked on a sort of political election that would honor the opinions of the Mexican public. Within a week of the contest announcement, the paper reported that politicians in Mexico were anxious to see if they would be included in the contest results. In subsequent weeks, the paper constantly promoted the contest as an obligation throughout Mexico and, quote, a reflection of the breadth of the voice of Mexicans. 3 months later, in July 1937, the paper announced its winners and began to publish biographies of the 36 candidates of the contest for its subscribers to educate themselves on. The paper expressed hope that the Mexican political observers had paved the way for a singular interest in the upcoming 1940 elections, open dialogue of the candidates. Ever since 1911, the paper claimed Mexicans were denied the opportunity to discuss politics freely and without persecution. It thus called on independent papers to utilize their pages as intellectual sites to discuss the coming elections as a means to promote free thinking of the populace, just as the contest had achieved. Mexicans, the paper hoped, would, quote, glimpse a future of democracy in Mexico. So to close, Lozano's periodicals ultimately complicate the periodization of the Mexican experience in the early 20th century. Chicano study scholars have situated the period between 1900 to 1950 within two political generations. The first, the immigrant generation, the second, the Mexican-American generation. So the immigrant generation is situated between 1900 to 1930 and is largely defined by the politics of immigration in the context of the Mexican Revolution. Like Lozano, this generation sought a return to Mexico and reproduced the idea of Mexico de afuera through their political and social activity in the US. By 1930s, however, this began to change. According to historian Mario T. Garcia, the Mexican-American generation sprung fully in the 1930s into the 1950s, with various political and civic organizations formed to cultivate a new ethnic consciousness to distinguish themselves from Mexican immigrants. Likewise, acculturation and racism formed new processes in which a generation became, quote, Mexican-American in the words of George Sanchez. In short, these two political generations look to different futures. At first glance, Lozano and his periodicals clearly fits within the immigrant generation model. I suggest, however, that he acted as a transitional figure between the two generations as part of what we should consider the revolutionary generation. This generation not only looked to a return to Mexico, but also continued to engage with the legacy of the revolution from afar to cultivate their cultural politics and identity in a diasporic nationalism. While some Mexicans sought to improve their lives by invoking the US citizenship during this period, others like Lozano resisted that urge by embracing the Mexican citizenship well into the 1930s up to 1940. By using La Prensa and La Opinión to promote that impulse, the Borderlands papers thus represented an alternative future for Mexicans residing in the US that continued to look towards Mexico, a flame that gradually fizzled by decade's end. Are we on time here? Do we have time for questions here?
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay,
Well,
great.
thank you so much, Andy.
Yeah. Sorry for that last slide. I was going to show some slides of the contest, which lasted from April 1937 all the way to July, but it became like a sort of spectacle through that time period, and every day the periodical would have something in the front highlighting it. So I was just going to show some of those, but yeah, I'm happy to answer some questions here.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you so much. No worries about the technical difficulties. Always happens. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we can I'll relay them to Andy. The first question is from Maria Luisa, and she said, how did you choose La Prensa and La Opinión over other Spanish language papers on the US side of the US-Mexican border?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So between 1900 and 1929, I think there are approximately over 200 Spanish language newspapers established in the US. So obviously I could have chosen any of the newspapers to examine. But I chose La Prensa and La Opinión in particular, just because they do have the biggest readership and their reach extended far beyond San Antonio or Los Angeles in the Southwest. There's reports that it was distributed up all the way in Chicago and other parts of the US where one might not assume. So it had a mass readership. So I think it provides a lot of insights of the type of things that Mexicans are reading during this period, which Lozano spearheaded, right? He really thought himself as a leader of the Mexican immigrant and exile community. And some of the things that I talk about highlighting Mexican citizenship and the democratic process are things that he wanted to promote and he did promote, as well as culture, right? Here I'm thinking every Sunday with the Sunday edition of these papers, I'm not sure about La Prensa, but La Opinión, every Sunday had an additional 30-page newspaper that had stories of Mexican history, culture, for people to read. So I just think it has a lot of materials, and based on the readership, it provides some good insights. So.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.
Looks like the other question is also from Maria Luisa. She asked, did the Nuevo León background of Lozano dictate the political leanings of La Opinión? Were the other contributors also from Nuevo León? It's interesting to see this movement from Nuevo León to California, a change from previous migrations.
Yeah, that's such a great question to think about regional identity of Mexican exiles and immigrants, and also more broadly Latin America. And that's a question that I'm trying to grapple with, not only with this chapter, but other chapters. So I guess to answer the first part of the question, I'm not too familiar with the history of Nuevo León, but I know certain characteristics of his background did influence his political leanings. For instance, Lozano and other contributors to his newspaper were Catholic. And this is the same time period as the Cristero Rebellion in 1926 and La Segunda in 1935, which is the struggle between the Catholic Church and the Mexican government in Mexico that secularizes education and takes away the property of the church during this period. So the church is being very much challenged. So Lozano does not identify as a Cristero, but he very much does sympathize with the cause, being a Catholic person. And uses that as a point to critique the Mexican government, that it's persecuting people that don't agree with them and that fight back towards that revolutionary legacy. What's the second part of the question? So I'm not, the other contributors besides Naranjo were not from Nuevo León. There's people from Guadalajara and Mexico City and all over the place. So it would be interesting to see sort of the regional characteristics of where they're coming from and how they all mobilize together in the US. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to do in the broader dissertation. Right now I'm writing the middle chapter of what I call the revolutionary diaspora from 1900 up to 1925, which sees a booming Mexican population in Los Angeles. So I'm trying to pinpoint to see where they're coming from kind of informs their political sensibilities while in Los Angeles, because it does vary. So I'm hoping that's something I can answer in other parts of the dissertation.
All right, we got another question from Carlos. He says, thank you for your research, Andy. Piggybacking off Maria Luisa's second question, is there a more notable ideological orientation in Lozano's papers compared to, for example, the Flores Magón papers? And do you find that Lozano and La Opinión were more in favor of certain factions than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they're obviously different in scope. So the Magón brothers publication, Regeneration, is, it's a leftist newspaper, both in ideology and scope. Published between 1905, I think, up to 1914, until the Magonistas are incarcerated due to their politics. So scholars have labeled Lozano and La Prensa and La Opinión, by extension, conservative papers. And in many cases they're harking back to this time of Porfirio Diaz, and they did support Madero, right, in 1911, but once he's overthrown in 1913, that's when they find refuge in California and Texas. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's conservative about their ideology, because Lozano is very careful to promote a politics that is leaning towards one side. If anything, I would identify him as a moderate. With the correspondence, that provides some insights of his conservatism, which, finds the revolution just communist and socialist. These are kind of like dirty words they use to critique them, not only in the paper, but also in personal correspondence. And there's not anything different that we see right now with this divide in the US between the left and right. But he's very careful, because I think he wants to mobilize the Mexican community in the United States with this sort of kind of centrist ideology to at least overthrow the Mexican government. So, but there's very much a difference between the Magon brothers, who are upfront about their politics, and they're not even nationalists. To say the nation and nationalism is for the elites, right? It doesn't serve the working class. And Lozano does have a nationalist bent to it, a conservative one. So I hope that kind of provides a little insight to that. We can obviously talk more through email or after the presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.
Maria Luisa just wanted to comment. Thanks. I'm looking at Tejanoism, Nuevo León, Sephardic Conversos, so I was very interested in Lozano's background. I'm always fascinated when I find Nuevo Leonenses in other parts of the Southwest US outside of Texas.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that comment. In Los Angeles in particular, you have a booming population from Sonora, right, being so close to the border, but also Michoacan and Guadalajara due to the Cristero Rebellion. So there's different diasporas that are coming to the US during this time period, and many make it one stop in Texas, whether it's San Antonio or El Paso, and eventually make it to Los Angeles once they establish themselves with funds and other means to get there. So a lot of people in this period are not just settling in one area. They either end up in Los Angeles or even Chicago for that matter, right? But that's also a different, larger history happening there. But yes, so I see the question. Yeah, so I obviously examined La Opinión from 1926 up to 1940, which was a pretty arduous task, even looking through my notes there. But I did consult the Lozano papers at the Huntington Library, and that's where you get a lot of that correspondence between Lozano and other exiles across the US or in Mexico or in Cuba for that matter. And that's what I was meaning by, in the paper, it sort of tries to take this sort of middle ground so as not to kind of isolate Mexicans in the US, but it's within that correspondence where you see that they truly believe the revolution is super dangerous, right? Each of these letters, mostly from 1930 up to 1938, they're constantly talking about how the government is threatening and what is happening there. That situation is not improving. So, my first instance of reading La Opinión was almost like, this almost reads off as propaganda a little bit. But then once you get into the actual correspondence, it's like these guys actually do believe that the revolution is very threatening to Mexicanidad, but also to the Mexican nation due to political suppression, which made it a little bit easier to read La Opinión and understand that context. But yeah, so I do use the Lozano papers at the Huntington Library, which is a pretty expansive. It's like over 50 boxes. So obviously it's hard to fit everything into this presentation, but that is the archive that I use for this particular chapter.
Any other last minute questions or thoughts for Andy? I think Carter wants to ask.
Yeah. Hi, Marlene. How are you? Andy, thanks for sharing your work. This is fascinating. I'm actually a student of the 20s and 30s as well, but in Spain. So I don't know your area real well. In fact, I'm here in Salamanca where it's bedtime at this point. But I I wanted to echo everyone else's comment about the, it sounds like based on some of the comments that you shared from the editors or the owners, and also some of the headlines, it seems like if the papers had a coherent philosophy, it was sort of opportunism, you know? But my question is, it sounds also like you're dealing with, I mean, I know that George Gallup's opinion polling technology comes around in 1935, which sounds like it's about the same time as the encuestas that were sent out, right?
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, what would you say? What would Lozano say to someone who said that maybe you're piggybacking off of this new polling technology with these encuestas, and you're not necessarily increasing democratic participation or something like that? And then, sort of a related question: what evidence do you have that this did happen? That he did sort of inculcate this democratic culture or participation? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. I think Lozano would use sort of, to address the first one, I think he would use that as a point of defense that this is the public opinion of the Mexican populace, whether you're in Mexico and whether you're in the United States. As I mentioned, the 1929 election, those are pretty jarring results, 92% for one candidate, right? And they, throughout the 30s, used that voter suppression, supposed voter suppression and marginalization of the revolutionary government for the Mexican populace. So I think that sort of poll, perhaps they were influenced, I'm not sure, I haven't seen that in the sources here, would be something that they would piggyback off of, right, as proof of what the Mexican population wants in Mexico. Remind me of your second question.
Oh, sorry. I was just curious that the sort of the encuestas that they sent out sort of overlap with. I mean, I know that like polling technology was a big thing, and something like Reader's Digest in the United States. Yeah. Americans instantly grabbed onto this, and like you could learn if you were a Coca-Cola drinker, you could lord it over the Pepsi drinkers because there were more of you than them, and you knew you had these results suddenly, blah blah blah. Anyway, I'm just curious as to what impact, if any, that would have had on editors of small newspapers trying to do something similar with their readerships, and what they felt like those numbers told them one way or the other once they got results.
So this one's sort of interesting because it's I'm not sure how they kind of organized the slips. So basically each paper from period between 1937 April to July, it would have a slip, and you'd write your name, and then you'd write all your candidates, and you would just send it into the office, right? So who's to say that someone wouldn't submit ones in different names and try to, win the prize, right? So it's hard to say how they actually regulated that, because I'm sure that did happen. But I would have to look back at the actual prize winners to kind of get to that. But I think for them, the point wasn't so much the results as it was to show like, hey, these are 36 candidates that Mexicans, not only in the US, but also in Mexico, envision as being a possible candidate for the president of Mexico, right? So even if they were, counted incorrectly, I think the point was that, this matters, the voice of the people matters. And they do print the list of all these peoples in their bios, and they range from all sides of the political spectrum. So it's just curious to see what individuals are actually participating in that. So I think I could probably align the slips with the Mexican border crossing records during this period to sort of see if it was legitimate or not. But like I said, I think the point was to honor the voice of the Mexican voting public.
Hey, any last minute comments or talks or questions or anything before we log off?
Well, if there's time, I have one final question.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, Andy, if it's okay, yeah.
Is there sort of like an endpoint in what you've seen in your research so far, Andy, in terms of if Ignacio Lozano, it was like a point where she stopped being as politically involved in sort of like the political developments in Mexico. Obviously, him being in exile, especially 1910s, 1920s, when the revolution still in its hotter moments. You know, trying to be objective, but still trying to clearly in his papers give some representation of all the different factions. Is there a point in your research where you see that he kind of backs off a little bit? He's just more, just simply reporting the news from Mexico, or what have you seen?
Yeah, so my dissertation purposefully ends in 1940, right? Because there's so many things happening. There's World War II, and then we have the Sleepy Lagoon incidents or murders and the Zusu riots in Los Angeles. And I think that's a turning point, not only for the paper, but for the Mexican experience in Los Angeles, right? So that's why I end in 1940. And also his only child, well, I believe his only child, is attending Notre Dame for journalism during this time period. So Ignacio Lozano Sr. Passes away in 1953. By then, his son is old enough to take over the paper. And that's when you see this is beyond the scope of my dissertation, but from the evidence, that's when it changes orientation. It's more focused on the US experience and US news. And I think that confirms George Sanchez's kind of becoming a Mexican-American argument, right? Because his son was born in Texas, right? And he's educated in Bend, Indiana. So he really kind of changes it to a Mexican-American newspaper, whereas before I consider it a Mexican borderlands newspaper, spearheaded by Lozano. So that's why I ended 1940, just to see that kind of slow transition, but for sure with Lozano Jr., he changes the political orientation and its focus and scope. And it's still in print today, not physically, but it's a digital newspaper. So.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I've done a little bit of research in the kind of like the more modern period of La Opinión, and I've read a few of those letters, like between father and son there.
Yeah.
Those papers, and it's something. But yeah, if you're interested in talking more, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up for the afternoon. Thank you so much, Andy. It was a lovely talk and very insightful. I'm from San Antonio, so I learned a whole lot about the town city. So it was a delightful talk. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we hope you all have a great afternoon.
Great. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.